You see just one. Do you
Yes,
see
it looks
just
good.
one slide there?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brand, and thank all of you for being here. Am I getting out clearly and everything is so through all right? Because
Sounds good.
Once I start talking, my remote speaker will turn itself off. So if someone really has a question, you're going to. So it's a pleasure talking to this group again. This group, plus as I see far-flung friends from all over the world. This is a talk I initially put together for this year's 68th Tucson Gem and Mineral Show. So we're only 11 years ahead of the Montgomery County crowd. And our theme this year was agates and opals and quartz. And so I put this together to talk about essentially silica, SiO2 in Mexico. So as always, thanks to TGMS for having had the opportunity to work with them for more than 40 years now. MinDat is a great source of geologic information, mineralogic information, and mineral photos every once in a while when you need them. Jeff Scoville and Joe Budd for images, and the miners of Mexico for risking their lives and livelihoods bringing us the specimens that we love so much. Anytime I talk about minerals in Mexico, I like to invoke the memory of my good friend, Dr. Miguel Romero, and everything that he did for preserving and promoting the study of minerals in Mexico. So I've been working in Mexico a long time, starting back in '77 with my master's thesis at the University of Texas at Austin, where Rich Kyle is joining us from today. I've been in TGMS since 1979, and I've been the exhibits chair for 35 years. So I like to say I started off looking like this, went to looking like this, to this, and then finally I have been here. In the course of 35 years as exhibits chair, I've seen an awful lot of quartz exhibits because, of course, quartz comes from everywhere, from micromounts to mega mounts. In this particular case, specimen being enjoyed by Gene Myron, who brought a spectacular exhibit of single crystals, including quartz, to the Tucson show this year. So part of the idea here is to make you more familiar with the SiO2 family minerals, which range from things like crystalline varieties, coesite, cristobalite, keatite, moganite, quartz, sepharite, stishovite, and tridymite, the cryptocrystalline varieties, chalcedony, chert, flint, jasper, amorphous varieties, including fulgurites, lecitellarites, and opal, and then some miscellaneous things like tiger's eye and some other fun lapidary materials. So the kind of notable varieties that we'll focus on today will be chalcedony, which includes agates and carnelian, chrome chalcedony, chrysoprase, heliotrope, moss agate, onyx, etc. Opal, including, well, I'm not going to talk about fluorite and geyserite, but they are part of that family. And then a lot of focus on quartz, everything from amethyst to Herkimer's to Smokies to shocked quartz, prasiolite, and some other things. So before we start getting into the pretty minerals, let's go down the SiO2 rabbit hole just a little bit so that we're all talking the same language here. SiO2 is just silicon dioxide. It is the combination of the two most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. Together, they make up better than 70% of the Earth's crust. So there's a heck of a lot of it around, and a lot of it tends to like to hang out as various forms of SiO2 plus or minus water and a few other things. So for those of you who are familiar with phase diagrams, and for those of you who aren't, here is a phase diagram of pressure versus temperature for the system SiO2. What we're most familiar with is call alpha quartz, which is what's present at the Earth's crust, low temperature, low pressure. As you go towards higher temperature and slightly increased pressures, you go into beta quartz. And ultimately, if you keep pushing, you get into liquid. But at very high temperatures and low pressures, you get tridymite and cristobalite. And then at very high pressure and high temperature, you get things like coesite and stishovite, mostly related to things like meteorite impacts, which shock the quartz and create these additional members of the family. So one of the things that's very important is that silica really likes water. It likes to move around in hot water. It likes to move around in hot vapor. It likes to move around in mixtures of hot water and hot vapors. You throw in a little acidity and stuff like that, and it moves around a little better. But fundamentally, hot water and hot water vapor is what does most of it. So one of the more interesting environments where this happens is in things like volcanoes, where the temperature is very high and the pressure is very low. And so that puts us down into this realm here of tridymite and cristobalite. And part of the reason for emphasizing this is that Mexico is actually the type locality for both of these species, which are pictured here in a hand sample of andesitic volcanic rocks from Cerro San Cristobal, which is just outside of the famous Pachuca silver district, about the world's probably fourth or fifth largest silver deposit. And this little batch of nubbins up here at the top of the specimen are a mixture of this being cristobalite and these little hexagonal plates being the tridymite. This is a specimen that was once upon a time at the Academy of Natural Science, Philadelphia. And you can see before that it's in a collection in Germany. So this is a specimen of considerable antiquity and a very good example of both species. It is not, as far as I know, the type specimen for either one. So when we look around the world at volcanic environments, famous Pacific Ring of Fire and things like the Tethyan belt running through between Asia and Europe and Asia and Africa. This is the place where we have many of the world's big volcanoes. And we're going to focus in this little stretch right here, which interestingly is about the only place around the Pacific where you don't have active subduction going. So it's a subduction environment that creates the kind of Pacific Ring of Fire volcanism that we're used to. Very simply, you have oceanic lithospheric mantle being subducted underneath the crust. You have partial melting down here in the asthenosphere with fluids coming off of the mantle of the descending slab. That sends magmas up into the shallow part of the crust, and it gives you the volcanic arcs that we see in the Cascades, basically throughout the Andes. When we look at Mexico, the manifestation of this kind of volcanism sort of has two ways of looking at things. The historic one, the Sierra Madre Occidental, shown here in sort of a terracotta color. This was active from about 45 to about 28 million years ago. And we'll look at this in more detail. And then you have what's called the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. This is the belt that's active now, and it's related to these big stratovolcanoes, Popocatépetl or Zava Tequila. That's a great name for a volcano. It's even better name for a beverage. But it's one of these up in here, Cerro San Cristobal, where cristobalite and tridymite. But one of the things we have to look at when we look at Mexico is we note the Sea of Cortez or the Gulf of California, depending on which side of the border you grew up, and recognize that until about 30 million years ago, that wasn't there, that you can slide Baja back along the San Andreas Fault and you get back into the kind of activity that was going on in Mexico through most of the middle tertiary and back into the Cretaceous. So we had a continuous subduction zone, we had continuous magmatism, and among other things, it created this huge diversity of lead, zinc, silver, copper, gold deposits, which I've spent most of my career exploring. So letting things go back to where they are now and focusing on the Sierra Madre Occidental. This is what it looks like when you're out there. So this is, you're looking at the upper part of this sequence, which was dominated by rhyolitic volcanism. These were very violent eruptions, and this is what made a lot of the high-grade silver gold vein deposits that make the treasure of the Sierra Madre. And are the setting, of course, for that famous movie and story. So these are not the kind of volcano that I showed earlier, the centrally vented Andean or Cascadian type volcano. These were what we call resurgent calderas. They've been rebranded as super volcanoes for the benefit of the TV channels that like to rattle our cages on the subject of potential volcanisms, but Yellowstone is a good example of one of these. So instead of having a central vent over the magma body, what you have is a big blister, big zit of rhyolitic magma that pushes up against the base of the crust, creates a blister, and instead of failing in the middle, it fails around the edges. So what you wind up with is a ring through which the magma is erupted. So it comes out along these faults here, and then the central block drops down and it fills with the volcanic material that's erupted. And that volcanic material is incandescent glass. It's like opening a can of beer, but instead of having a nice, comfortable, cold can of beer in your hand, you've got about a 1200 degree mass of incandescent, frothy glass pouring out of that can. You can see that the ring fracture zone for this is anywhere from 30 miles plus. And you have hundreds to thousands of cubic kilometers of this incandescent froth erupted more or less instantaneously. This is not something that you're going to get away from. This is an idea of what would happen if Yellowstone went off as it has in the past. So you have the Yellowstone supervolcano here, the absolute kill zone here, the primary ash zone surrounding that secondary ash zone. So you can see that this will wipe out most of the life in half of the western half of the United States easily if another one of these went off. Well, what was going on in Mexico during the mid-Tertiary is one after another of these things went off for about 45 million years. And so you wound up with this whole series of these overlapping calderas that deposited these huge thicknesses of this volcanic glass. Well, so imagine these volcanoes going off one after another, actually erupting around the edge rather than through the middle. Volcanic glass is essentially it's a quenched liquid. It's not crystalline. It's actually unstable. And we're not talking about obsidian here. What we're talking about is shards of glass that accumulate, like you had a block of pumice stone or something like that and you bashed it up. But what you see is these nice what we call triple junctions, which are the places where glass bubbles came together and then they broke apart. And because this stuff is unstable, it begins to devitrify, which just means becoming less glassy. So you start off with these rocks that are this mass of compacted shards of glass, and they get progressively more and more devitrified, and ultimately they recrystallize as things like tridymite. This is all going on at a very fine scale, and it all happens fairly quickly as these big, thick volcanic piles begin to cool off and consolidate. So devitrification liberates a lot of silica dioxide, silica SiO2. So you've got hot gases, you've got water involved in all of this stuff, a lot of steam coming off of it. And that breaks down the glass, liberates the silica, and at high temperatures, that silica redeposits as chalcedony, forming agates and fun things like that. And at lower temperatures, it forms more amorphous materials in the opal category. So opal is not as simple as the name would suggest. There's actually two broad families of opal. There's crystalline opal, made up of cristobalite, opal C, which is quite rare. There's opal CT, which is crystalline tridymite, and that makes things that we call fire opal. And then you get into the realm of amorphous opals, which are can be like a gel-like opal AG, creates a bunch of little spheres that when those line up and are ordered, you get precious opal, which is probably opal that most people think of when you think of opal. And then you have network forming opals, opal AN, when these are typically pretty highly disordered, but they make common opal, which we tend to call iolite. So Mexico is well endowed with opal CT. Mexico is very famous for various kinds of fire opal, especially the cherry opals from Querétaro and Jalisco. Sometimes they get what they call crystal opal, where instead of being red, the fire actually hangs in a gel-like transparent matrix. And you can get some pretty large pieces of it. They make very attractive specimens and even more attractive specimens, and again, or gemstones rather. And then you have other examples where less colored, but still very highly colorful fire opal, typically from Jalisco. And of course, this stuff makes its way into the tourist and jewelry market with a fair amount of matrix, still supporting the opal. And in this particular case, these beautiful needle-like crystallites of I don't know what, but it makes it fun to have a crystal specimen within a non-crystallized material. Precious opal, less common in Mexico. As I said earlier, this is the stuff that tends to form from a series of well-stacked and well-ordered tiny, we're talking micrometer scale spheres of opal, and they line up like marbles in a box, and they break up and diffuse light. So when light hits it, it bounces off the planes between those spheres, breaks up the light, and gives you the spectacular play of fire that you get in precious opal. And there is some of this in Mexico. There's just a new find that's being promoted from the mountains of Chihuahua, which has a blue matrix to it. It's very attractive material. Unfortunately, these times or the conditions for making pretty opal in the sense of precious or fire opal are fairly rare. So mostly what you get is what the Australians would call potch, or just common opal, which sometimes will give you a nice bit of color, but mostly is just very fine-grained, glassy looking material. We are fortunate in Mexico that a lot of the devitrifying volcanics create beautiful gel-like hyalite opal. So this is transparent, just looks like a little blob of white goo on the rock. It does facet nice little stones, not terribly attractive in themselves, but they do have a secret, which is that not only does devitrification liberate silica, it liberates iron, uranium, and fluorine. And when you liberate uranium in this environment, it tends to form the uranyl ion, and that gives you a gorgeous chartreuse or acid green fluorescence under both long and short wave light. So you have things like famous uranium glass, which was very popular back in the Victorian era, to the point where people even made chandeliers out of the stuff. We do have one occurrence in Mexico. Actually, it's the only occurrence in the world that I'm aware of an opal or a hyalite opal, which is fluorescent in daylight. So this is what the material looks like under an incandescent light, very light green, kind of attractive. But if you look at it under shaded sunlight, it actually picks up the ultraviolet radiation from the sunlight and causes daylight luminescence. So we call it electric opal because it goes from pretty blah to you walk outside on a cloudy day and you get this electric effect as the material lights up. So these are natural little droplets or grouplets of the material, and a specimen of it on matrix. And a before and after specimen of a large blob of this that's set in a necklace that my wife wears when I give these talks, because I get to hit it with a 405 nanometer laser pen from across the room, and this thing just lights up like a Christmas tree. It also cuts spectacular gemstones. Unfortunately, there hasn't been very much of this material found, but this color change makes it tremendously popular in gem. Probably the most common form of silica associated with devitrifying volcanics is chalcedony, which occasionally forms these very attractive roses. You can actually see these little vents within some of these nodules where the volcanic gases, entering into this void and creating sort of a miniature vapor geyser within the enclosed geode. In some cases, a large number of these have been found. This is a drawer in my collection from a locality called Trancas in Chihuahua. They have wonderful little worms with crystals on them and things like that. When you hit that with an ultraviolet, they really pop. So very attractive material for the fluorescent collectors, and the individual roses or flowers or whatever you want to call it, chalcedony, can really make marvelous specimens. Mexico is justifiably famous for her agates. Many of these well-known things like lagunas and crazy lace, the Luna amethyst agates, the coyamito lavenders. This is actually also crazy lace that hasn't broken. So these are silica replacements and coating on what was originally dogtooth calcite lining a collapsed cavern. Here's an example of agate replacing elongate aragonite crystals. And in this particular case, you have agatized internal cross-bedded sediments. So it's telling you, they can tell you a lot about the environment this stuff is from. The agate diggings tend to be fairly extensive. It's all handwork, largely handwork, maybe with a compressor. This is the area around Santa Lucia, where the crazy lace agates come from. And we're out there picking a few things off the dump. You do get the wonderful thunder eggs that look like other things. In this particular case, one remarkably bird-like. And then spectacular things like the Laguna agates with the oranges and reds and purple banding, classic material. This is a piece from Megaw collection. And then the heart of Chihuahua, or the heart of Chihuahua, the heart of Chihuahua, found by Alberto Rey with Dave Wilbur, who many of you know, many of you may not know, was actually largely responsible for reviving interest in agates. When I started collecting in the 70s, agates were regarded as a sort of a redheaded stepchild of the world of mineral specimens. Well, they have now, thanks in large part to Dave's efforts, taken on a new life and a new respectability in the collectors. Here's a spectacular example of chalcedony pseudomorphic. That specimen is about 75 centimeters tall, so 2.5 feet long. Gorgeous piece from the Coyamito locality in Chihuahua. And Mexico also has examples of fire agate, which is caused by very thin banding of the agates with a little water trapped in between the bands, and that water breaks up the light, typically giving you these sort of eerie, almost insect, bottle fly kinds of greens and oranges. Beautiful material when properly cut. It takes a real expert because the layer of color is very thin. Once you've cut through it, you've lost it forever. Possibly the best known form of silica in Mexico is coconut geodes that come from Chihuahua. Don't look like a whole lot on the outside, but when you cut them open, you get these beautiful banding patterns. In this case, you've got all of this early goethite that grew into the pocket, and then banded chalcedony, finishing with amethyst. And sometimes you get extra species coming out the middle. For those of you who knew the late Pete Keller, who passed away late last year, who was the curator of the Bauer Museum in Los Angeles, he did his dissertation on the inclusions in these geodes at the University of Texas. So there's another plug for the Longhorns sneaking in here. And these geodes are everywhere. This is a shot from the first Changsha show in China in 2013. It was probably the busiest booth at the entire show outside of the jade booth. And they had bought several containers of Chihuahua coconut geodes, and the people were lining up just as they do in shows here and everywhere else you've been, to have somebody either cut them open with a saw or break them open with one of those pipe wrenches that people use. Tremendous quantity of these things have been produced. You get down into central Mexico, into some of the other agate, some of the other geode localities. This is the one in Aguascalientes. This guy owns this is the house of the man who owns the geode field in that particular neighborhood. He has covered his entire house with geodes, and these things that are these meter plus diameter boulders that you see here are actually chalcedony lined geodes that have been turned into planters. The only other place I could imagine you seeing something like this would be in West Texas, where someone would be crazy enough to cover their house with this. When you dig into some of the geodes in some of the less known fields like Truncus, you can get some spectacular linings in these things. These began as elongate anhydrite crystals that were then replaced by very fine-grained crystalline quartz, and then these drupelets that you see on top are little blobs of highlight opal on top. This particular specimen is about 15 centimeters across, so this really makes a fairly impressive piece for a collector. And as you transition out of the chalcedony and fine-grained quartz field and you start to get into the world of vapor phase deposition, crystalline quartz, you start to get these crazy scepters, reverse scepters that then go back to scepters. These are from the Liliana mine just outside Chihuahua that Benny Fenn mined for many years, but they come from a number of other localities as well. Sometimes the scepters are amethyst, sometimes they're smoky, sometimes they're transparent, but you always get a lot for your money with one of these, with scepters, reverse scepters, again, back and forth. Some pretty spectacular growth. This is a miniature. Here's an example of one backlit, all these central crystal that grew first, and then these parasitic scepters and reverse scepters. And some of these make absolutely stunning thumbnails. This thing is just about little better than 2.5 centimeters. So very nice and very dramatic. Just as you do in upstate New York, you do get what are effectively diagenetic quartzes, similar to the Herkimer quartzes. In Mexico, they call them Oaxacamers, even though they come from about as far away from Oaxaca as you can get in Mexico. So Oaxaca, for those of you who aren't familiar with Mexican geography, is a state in southern Mexico. These come from Coahuila, which borders Texas. In fact, these are not that far from San Antonio, but these beautiful Fenster Herkimer style quartzes, very abundant in a few places, and they can get pretty big. There's an example of my friend Jesus holding one that's bigger than a football, certainly basketball size. Spectacular pieces, if you like that sort of. So now let's get a little hotter. Let's get into the zone of the ore deposits, which really is what I spend most of my time working on, both carbonate replacement deposits, which are shown on by the yellow squares here. So that includes places like Santa Eulalia, San Pedro Corralitos, Los Lamentos, Naica, Concepcion del Oro, Ohuela, Charcas. Many of these very well-known specimen localities. Many of them have produced a lot of good quartz specimens. And then into the red dots, which are the silver-dominated vein deposits, and then out into the purple dots, which are the more gold-rich vein deposits as you work your way west. But these belts of deposits are what has made Mexico historically the world's largest silver producer. Over 25% of all the silver mined in human history has come from Mexico. So this brings us back to that same slab model that we were looking at a little earlier, but here in a little more detail, where we have a few thermal gradients thrown in on things, and then focusing on the differentiation of these magma bodies in the shallow crust, which is where the action is as far as making the deposits that we care about. And as we zoom in on that, this would be the top of that. You're talking a lot of hot water moving around in these systems. In the porphyry environment, it's sort of concentrated right in and around the intrusion. And then you get high sulfidation gold and copper systems, low sulfidation gold and silver systems, all related to how the fluids migrate away from these thermal elements. But it's all based on moving hot water. So I've spent a lot of time working on carbonate replacement systems. In a very simple sense, these are an intrusive body, a magma that's placed in shallow levels in the crust. It's when it's placed in limestone, and in Mexico, you can have as much as 2,000 meters of limestone for one of these things to be placed into. You generate skarns immediately around the stock, and then as the fluids migrate away from that, they react with the limestone to form massive sulfide mantos of chimneys, and ultimately veins when they get a long distance away from the surface. And then they have a big alteration halo on top of it. But we're going to really focus on this kind of environment here. And in the skarn environment, primary anhydrous minerals that form first are things like garnets and pyroxenes. So as the rocks are heating up, water is forced away, so the species that form are anhydrous. And then as the system temperature sort of peaks and then begins to cool, water starts to come back into the system, and we go into what we call retrograde alteration. These anhydrous pyroxenes are converted into amphiboles. The garnets get turned into a mess of clays and carbonates and fine-grained silica. You're lucky if you can still recognize where the garnets used to be. But that process actually liberates a fair amount of silica from those anhydrous skarn silicates, and it gets redeposited as quartz, in many cases with things like amphibole derived from the hydration of those pyroxenes included into the quartz to give you a very attractive green color called praise in the lapidary world. but makes for very nice mineral specimens. And you see these sorts of specimens characteristic of skarn deposits around the world. So you can find them from Dalmagors, you can find them from Seriphos, you can find them from the Wanagong skarns in Inner Mongolia, as well as a lot of the deposits in Mexico. This particular one is from Nika. It's been overgrown by calcite. Sometimes all you get is just nice, sharp, limpid, beautiful quartz specimens. This is doubly terminated from the main silicate ore body in Santiago, a little stalactite of siderite. And because these deposits tend to be long-lived, whoa, that's what happens when you drop your house. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't do that on purpose. Try. So these are long-lived multi-stage systems. And so part of the result of that is you wind up with multi-stage specimens. So you have an initial stage of single quartz crystal, and then later stages with multiple quartzes growing in every direction. So from an exploration standpoint, this gets me excited because it tells me the system stewed in its own juice for a long time. Large. And some of these deposits like mica can produce some really nice scepter quartzes. Both of these are cabinet specimens, so they're 8-9 centimeters long. Doubly terminated scepter, singly terminated scepter here. And it's very common because you're liberating iron in this process for hematite to form and get included in quartz. So you have calcite here with a little bit of a green cast because it's got some of those amphiboles that I mentioned tied up in it. And then this quartz with a phantom of hematite, giving a very nice red color to the specimen. You do get true citrine in a number of these localities. This is from Charcas. That's a cabinet-sized specimen. Very, very glossy, very nice saturated orange-brown color. And in many cases, you do get amethyst as well. Tasco and Santiago are probably the most famous for this style of hunky but very limpid amethysts. And again, you pick up evidence for multiple stages. Here we have this is a miniature early stage of quartz covered by manganese oxide and little balls of rhodochrosite, then overgrown by a limpid later stage of quartz, just telling you that this system went through multiple phases of mineralization and deposition, which is, again, something that explorationists really want to see. And just another example, that's actually not galena, that's pyrite. I must have spiked the label from somewhere else. This is from Concepcion del Oro with a halo of quartz crystals growing off of it in turn coated. So it's a nice, I think this is called the crown of Moctezuma. That's what it was dubbed by the dealer who sold the specimen from Concepcion del Oro. And again, nice combos, in this case, amethyst on galena from Nika. You can see that the galena is a little bit corroded, so it was probably not in equilibrium with the fluids that were depositing that amethyst, but nonetheless makes for a very attractive specimen in miniature. And you get into places like Charcas, you get the amethyst in this case on nice pale green datolite. That's a large cabinet specimen. And going back in the other direction, this is a thumbnail. Again, citrines, nice white, dark dander. So really pretty specimens. These are actually fairly common. And of course, you get things like pyrite coating the quartzes, giving it a very nice contrast there. And it's very common in a number of these carbonate replacement systems to get skeletal quartz from very rapid crystallization. In this case, this is from Nika. These are big green pseudohexagonal twins of fluorite with pyrite, and then this giant skeletal quartz. This specimen is 25 centimeters tall. So it's a large or museum-sized specimen. This is the problem. So you get quartz on fluorite, but you can also get things like fluorite on the quartz. This is from the San Antonio mine at Santa Eulalia. Late stage fluorite is a very common part of the paragenesis there. In this particular case, it just managed to get a hold of a pocket of these nice spiky quartzes to give you these very attractive and unfortunately very few specimens. And the quartz can also do a lot of pseudomorphing. In many cases, they're simply epimorphs, but in material like this, the quartz is actually replacing the danburite all the way to the core. This is a large group, so that thing is about 30 centimeters in diameter. Nice big, what were sharp dandurites before they got attacked. And quartz also in these deposits also sticks around through oxidation. So you wind up with your early quartz crystals that then have things like 5 centimeter doubly terminated azurites growing on top, making a very nice base for the specimen. Or in other cases like Sierra Rica and Chihuahua, you get these nice groups of sharp 3 to 4 centimeter quartzes with these beautiful little azurites growing on top of them. And in this case, lots of little yellow wolfenids scattered all over. Just a close up to show you how attractive these are. You can find these if you look around. Most of this material came out in the 70s, but a bunch of it came out again about 7 or 8 years ago. And of course, the quartz then grows on top of the oxide. So here we have a spray of quartz from the Milpias deposit in Sonora on top of Chrysocolla. And Kareth Graber's famous Christmas tree specimen. So you had quartz crystals that were then covered with azurite, which was pseudomorph malachite, and you had a druzy quartz layer on top of that. This is a large miniature specimen. It's one of her signature pieces. And Concepcion is famous for these. This is again a group of malachite after azurite, in turn covered by druzy quartz. This is a miniature. Shifting from the CRDs to the vein deposits, these are, of course, the reason Mexico became so famous as a silver producer. The big veins stuck out on the surface. They were mined prehistorically, so when the Spaniards showed up in the early 1500s, not only did they find the veins sticking out of the ground, they found people poking around and mining small quantities of silver and gold from them. So within 100 years or maybe 150 years, the Spaniards found virtually every significant vein deposit in Mexico that cropped out on the surface. The nice thing about that is that people began to think that that's the only way you could find these veins. And several of us have been successful in our careers by looking for veins that didn't crop out on the surface, that got overlooked by that particular attitude. The best place in the world to be for silver deposits, silver vein deposits, is here in the Fresnillo Trend. This is down in central Mexico. So the Tropic of Cancer comes right through here. And this belt runs from Guanajuato through Zacatecas, through Fresnillo, Sombrerete, San Martin. So this belt contains four of the world's 15 billion plus silver deposits. Fresnillo now being the world's biggest silver district at about 3.3 billion ounces of silver between what's been mined, what's in resources. So this belt has produced about 12% of all the silver mined anywhere in the world over human history. So this is a great place to focus exploration. It's also a great place to look for mineral specimens. Fresnillo, very famous. This is what it looked like in the 1800s before they gutted this hill and the top of it collapsed. And in places like Guanajuato, you had these massive galleries. This photograph was taken in about 1906, giving you some idea of what the Veta Madre or the mother vein in Guanajuato looked like when it was in production. You can see very modern mining techniques at work here, including real attention to safety equipment, hard hats, good mine lighting, things like that. These guys were hacking away at the walls by candlelight. Pretty hard to imagine what life would have been like for a miner in those days. But these are the deposits that have produced things like some of the world's, if not the world's best anthites, pseudomorphic, paramorphic argentite. This specimen is a miniature. It's from Fresnillo. Polybasites, Guanajuato, Fresnillo, Las Chispas, some of the world's best. Again, this one is a miniature. Aguilarite, for which Mexico is the type locality. So you know the formula for a canthite and you substitute some of the silver with selenium, that's what gives you Aguilarite. Type locality is Guanajuato, and this is a specimen from that locality. So when we look at epithermal veins, epithermal is just a fancy geologic name that it means shallow heat is all it means. So these deposits form very close to the Earth's surface. Fluids rise along the crack until they boil, and this isn't pot of water on the stove boiling. This is opening a can of beer or a bottle of champagne kind of boiling. That pressure release causes the deposition of, first of all, the precious metals, the gold and silver dominantly dropping out above the boiling zone, with base metals below that. And then everything chokes up with calcite and quartz. Pressure builds back up again, and it's lather, rinse, repeat. And these big veins go through hundreds, if not thousands, of cycles of this process of shattering and boiling, deposition and resealing the deposit. And the surface of these deposits winds up with these big silica caps. So the Mammoth Hot Springs at Yellowstone is a good example of this. This is the model we use to find these deposits. Most of the deposits the Spaniards found had been cut off at this level, so all of this had been removed by erosion. What explorationists have to do now is to figure out how to see through all of this down to the vein underneath. The challenge is that this can be 3 or 4 kilometers across, and this target can be 3 or 4 meters across. So you're talking about looking for a very narrow stem for a very large mushroom cap. So it takes a lot of work to narrow down and get the drill holes in the right place. But in the Fresnillo district, we have been successful with that. We have found what is now the largest single silver vein in the Fresnillo district. It will produce better than 250 million ounces of silver over the next 25 years. And that's me planting a kiss on it the first time I actually got down underground to see the thing. So these deposits move around an enormous amount of silica. And they do it in 2 ways, because you have this intrusive that comes in, differentiates, it gives you what we call a cupola, a little zone on the top where you have this felsic magma that's highly evolved, it's charged with volatiles. It develops a big pool of metalliferous, heated metalliferous brine around it. But around that and above that, the groundwater is heated and it's driven into circulation by this heat. on a very large scale. So we're talking 5 to maybe as much as 10 kilometers across here. So these circulating fluids dissolve enormous amounts of silica and calcite, and then they redeposit it as this mushroom cap, the silica cap on the system with calcite forming at the ends. And every once in a while, this system will rupture and you'll get a pulse of these metalliferous fluids pumped into these structures, cutting across the silica cap. So from an explorationist standpoint, you have to see through the difference between all of that silica that's been stirred up and redeposited from barren fluids versus the silica that's been moved in from these highly evolved metalliferous brines. And that's the real challenge, is to find these. But when you do, it's more than worth it. And these deposits, because they contain so much silica, contain a lot of quartz. So this quartz comes out as white quartz, typically multi-stage. As you can see, this is a very large cabinet specimen. This is from the Santa Barbara mine in Chihuahua. And a lot of these deposits have enough iron in them, so a lot of the quartz comes out as amethyst. This one's from Guanajuato. That's about 20 centimeters across. And again, multi-stage system. So these plates that you see here began life as hexagonal calcite crystals that were replaced by quartz, in this case, amethystine quartz. And then a later stage of scalenohedral calcite came in and grew on top of those. And if the process keeps going, you'll see those rhombohedral or scalenohedral calcites get replaced by later amethyst. So when you see one of these specimens, it's telling you this system went through a lot of cycles. You pick it up in some of the other gangue minerals. These biscuits began as bundles of aragonite. They've now been completely replaced by fine-grained quartz. And of course, they are sitting here on a coarse quartz matrix. And you get repetitions of this cycle. So you have an amethyst that's then covered in calcite, and calcite gets replaced, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to wrap up here focusing amethyst, because as a collector species, amethyst is one of the least expensive and most attractive. And from an exploration standpoint, it can tell you a lot. It could also lead you down a path of many red herrings, but you'll never go wrong with a good amethyst specimen. This is a big plate from Guanajuato. It's probably 30, 40 centimeters across. Classic examples of amethyst from Mexico, from one of the Guerrero locality, typically with their clear tips and sort of wastes or fat barrel-shaped crystals with that lovely, luscious gumball purple coming in the middle. Lighter purple and much more abundant sharp crystals that you see from Veracruz, and then the very rare Japan law amethyst specimens that come out once in a blue moon from Veracruz locale. Several examples of material from Veracruz, nice doubly terminated typical purple on coarse scalenohedral calcites. This is a large cabinet specimen. The rarer scepters from there, but with the typical grape jelly purple crystals, sometimes moving a little bit bluer, but still a very, very gorgeous color. This is a cabinet specimen. And then the very typical habit that I mentioned a minute ago of the barrel-shaped or wasted amethysts from Guerrero, very commonly with very nice phantoms. It's about 10 centimeters. Another example from the same locality, very commonly forming these groups of crystals radiating from a base, sometimes even looks like it would have gone the other way to make a full bow tie if it hadn't had rock in the background. And just, if you can't tell, I love the color and luster and overall habit material from Guerrero. And an example of one that did get a chance to go in both directions. This has got to be one of the most aesthetic specimens ever found. It's doubly terminated. It's about 12 centimeters from end to end with this beautiful calcite growing right at the waist where those two groups of diverging crystals move from. So that's the end of talk on Silica, Mexico. As I've mentioned earlier, I am the exhibits chairman for the Tucson show. I'm always looking for new exhibitors. Our theme next year is pegmatite minerals. So we're interested in examples from pegmatites from as many different places as we can get them. Pegmatites obviously produce a fair amount of quartz, but we will be happy to accept everything from tourmalines to stibiotantalite and whatever happens to be in your collection, wherever you happen to be. So give me a call if you'd like to do that. Drop me an email. And with that, thank you for your attention and your time, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was really great. There's a lot of helpful information in there when it comes to differentiating the different silica types. We're going to open it up to questions. If you have one, you can either just ask it out loud or put it in the chat. I do see I have two questions so far in the chat. The first one is, what element causes the color of citrine quartz? Iron.
It's iron. It's just in an oxidized form as opposed to a reduced form. That's why you can take those big, low quality amethyst geodes from Brazil and Uruguay and put them in the barbecue and heat them up, and they suddenly come out citrine because you've just shifted the valence state of that iron from reduced into oxidized.
Okay. And then our second question, I'm not sure what it's referring to exactly, but it says, is that real event depth or after miles of erosion? Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Hey, this is Johan from Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you, Pete. And it's good to see something else than ugly blacks in your talks. My question went back to the cross section that you made, when these dikes and skarns come up, and I just wanted to know if that event was truly happening at about 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers deep, or if what you were presenting was what happening after a couple of miles of rock eroded away. And I think you answered the question, that what the Mexicans found was after erosion. So these events of the boiling and the coming up probably took place much deeper, but if you don't mind elaborating a little more on that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So the carbonate replacement deposits, which I talked about first, the work that's been done based on fluid inclusions and various other kinds of paleobarometry indicate 2 to maybe as much as 4 kilometers depth below the surface for those deposits. So they're forming under lithostatic conditions primarily. So they're not boiling systems, although what we now recognize is a lot of these systems rupture, and you can wind up with a hydrostatic overprint. So you wind up with something that looks like epithermal, well, actually is epithermal mineralization superimposed on the material that formed under lithostatic conditions. So you see this transition in porphyry coppers. We're starting to see it more and more in the replacement systems as we move around. As far as the epithermal veins are concerned, we actually have a very good idea how far below the surface they form. Because, for example, in Fresnillo, when you're walking around on top of that silica cap, you can find root traces, you can find silicified, shallow lake environment or geyser basin type sediments and geyser balls, things like that on the surface. So that's telling you you're walking around on the paleo surface, and you know exactly how far you have to go below that to get into the good part of the mineralization. That's about 350 meters in the case of where we're working in Fresnillo. So Stuart Simmons has done an excellent job with his fluid inclusion work in the district, elaborating on that. But we now have essentially the full spectrum from the paleo surface down through the veins. Actually, we can track it down to more than a kilometer and a half below the surface. And we're still seeing evidence for stacking of boiling within those structures. So those structures were open enough that you had boiling conditions going on at greater than a kilometer's depth below the surface.
Thank you.
Yes,
Peter, I have a question for you. I put it in the chat, but I noticed I mistyped part of it. I didn't mean the talk in the geodes, but the talk on the geodes. You mentioned someone, I believe you said it was in Texas, gave a talk on the geodes. I have a fairly large collection of Las Choyas because I'm very interested in the micro minerals that are in there. Did that person in Texas talk about the Las Choyas and what how they're formed and such? And
well,
if so,
he did. He did. His name was Peter Keller. He unfortunately passed away late last year. And he did his doctorate at the University of Texas at Austin on the micro minerals and other minerals in the geodes from Las Choyas. So my guess is that a copy of his dissertation is probably available on university microfilms or somewhere out there on the internet. But it's a very detailed treatment of the species that he recognized. He had the advantage of being the curator of what was called the Barron collection. Colonel E.M. Barron was a mineral dealer based out of El Paso for many years. And when Colonel Barron passed away, he left his collection to the University of Texas at Austin, and that included a swimming pool filled with Las Choyas geodes.
oh,
Pete's job was to disperse that material. And part of the way he did that was to open up hundreds and hundreds of those geodes. And that was the material that he had to work with, in addition to stuff that he collected himself in the field. So it was the beginning of what was a very illustrious career as a museum curator and gemologist.
do you know about what year this dissertation and his talk was given?
I'm gonna have to guess 77. This Pete was just leaving the department when I was doing my master's thesis there. So 77, 76, probably.
Okay, great. I love those Las Choyas geodes. They're just my favorite.
Well, they're favorites worldwide. That the line at that show in China for all those people who were breaking up the Chihuahua geodes at Chihuahua, it was so humorous to see that happen.
Yeah.
Halfway around the world.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Allie, you got a question?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, Pete. I think what stood out to me is I feel like I've been lying to my students all this time, telling them that opal is a mineraloid and is amorphous. Did I catch right that there's actually some opals that are actually in the crystalline category? And is that unique to Mexico, or is that more common than I'm aware? I was really interested in that opal slide. Thank you.
Well, and it is not unique to Mexico. That is based on opal research that's been done worldwide. Dr. Eloise Gayot, who is the curator of the École des Mines collection in Paris, has done a lot of work on that. There was a Sincanca symposium on opals, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, that went into those pretty fair detail, the different kinds of opal in pretty fair detail. I think actually if you do something like Google opal, you will wind up with references that will lead you in the direction of the crystallized, the opal, the opal CT and cristobalite opals, as well as the different kinds of amorphous opals. So you only half lied to your students.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Which puts you way ahead of many of the professors that I had.
Thanks. I've super enjoyed the talk. Also, I love Guerrero amethyst. I was definitely not a fan of amethyst until I saw Mexican amethyst.
Just further to what was said, the Kansas Symposium on Opal was 2015. And if you have access to the GIA, those symposiums are available online.
Thank you, Barbara.
Welcome.
Are there any more questions for Peter?
Did we get through everything that was in the chat?
I just wanted to ask about the picture behind your head, the cookie monsters.
The Cookie Monsters?
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons for loving the internet. It's a pair of it's a Chihuahua geo that somebody cut in half, and they liked the general shape. The sad truth is that the eyeballs have actually been drilled out to make them look a little more realistic. I have seen better examples of the same effect that didn't require artificial manipulation. But you too can cut several thousand geodes and hope you can find something.
I'll get on that.
All right, well, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank everyone again for coming out today to listen to Peter. Thank you, Peter, very much for your talk. It was great. We hope to see you all next month for our April speaker, but yeah, thank you.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for
you,
the invite.
everybody.